You ever get fined for being too responsible? Not careless, not lazy, just responsible in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong zip code and skin tone. That was the morning Sarah Collins realized preparation doesn't always protect you, and sometimes it paints a target on your back. But first, leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts. Sarah's life ran like a courtroom clock, no second wasted, no detail missed. At 35, she moved with the precise rhythm of a woman who had made it up the hardest hill without looking back. Her alarm buzzed at 6:30 a.m., and by 6:32 she was already brushing her teeth while NPR murmured in the background. Her apartment was small but clean, crisp like a closing argument, a home office lined with neatly stacked case files, court attire already steamed and hanging. Today she wore the navy blazer, but not for war. Just a simple parking ticket at municipal court, not federal, not headline-worthy, just a bureaucratic hiccup that needed ironing out. But Sarah didn't do casual the way most people did. Her casual was still composed, still deliberate. Black slacks, white blouse, hair pinned neatly back. She had just started wearing it natural again after a decade of heat and pressure, not just from flat irons but from offices that equated straight hair with straight character. She looked at herself in the mirror and didn't just see a federal prosecutor. She saw a Howard Law's top graduate, the Assistant United States Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia. She saw someone who had earned her stripes, one evidence binder at a time. This morning wasn't supposed to mean anything. Just pop in, dispute a ridiculous ticket, and move on with the day. She had pictures on her phone of the contradictory signs. One said, "No parking 7-9 a.m." The other said, "Permit parking only," stacked like lies on a bad affidavit. It was a formality, a 15-minute formality. That's what she told herself as she grabbed her travel mug and banana. Halfway out the door, she remembered her files for the Thompson case. Out of habit, she tossed them into her bag. Habit was her safety net. The Atlanta skyline glowed gold in the early morning sun as she pulled out of her garage, the hum of her Mercedes grounding her. That car was her gift to herself after nailing a corruption case that took 18 months and cost her 2 vacations and a relationship. She noticed the looks when she drove it. Black woman, polished rims, no visible struggle. People don't always say what they think, but the shift in their faces tells you enough. She turned on NPR, some piece about prison reform humming in the background, when her Bluetooth screen blinked. Incoming call, U.S. Attorney office line. Her heart clicked into gear. That was never casual. "Sarah, I hate to do this," her boss said, "but the Thompson defense just dropped a motion, something that could upend our entire argument. I need your eyes on it before noon." Her grip tightened on the wheel. The Thompson case was Georgia's biggest human trafficking trial in a decade. Losing it would mean letting monsters walk back into neighborhoods. "I'm sending the files now," he said. "Can you look it over and call me in 30? There was no question in her mind. Yes, of course. She pulled into a parking lot behind a coffee shop, tapped into her hotspot, and booted up her laptop in seconds. The document downloaded. As her coffee cooled in the cup holder, she dissected every line like she was preparing for war. Point by point, she shredded the motion with clarity and precision. Notes flowed fast. Her mind lit up like it always did when the law got complex and sharp. She didn't just love the law, she commanded it. She glanced at her watch. 8:50 IMM. She froze. The court appearance was at 9 o'clock. The municipal court was still 10 minutes away. Without factoring parking. She slammed the laptop shut, emailed a quick summary back to her boss, and threw the car into reverse. She hadn't even touched the banana. Atlanta traffic was thick with indifferent red lights and merging cars that forgot how to signal. She whispered a prayer as she made the final turn into the municipal lot at 9:10. She grabbed her phone, wallet, ticket documentation, and the half-squished banana from the seat beside her. The fruit had gone from yellow to bruise in minutes, a metaphor so ripe it hurt. That banana had done nothing wrong, but timing had turned it to mush. Sarah was starting to feel the same. At 9:15, she entered the courtroom. Shoulders back, steps firm, late, yes, but still composed. What she didn't know was that her kindness, her choice to serve justice at the federal level before attending to her own rights, was about to cost her $500 0 cents and nearly break a judge's career. Judge William Barrett had been on the bench for 30 years, and it showed, not just in the creases of his tailored robe, but in the practiced way he wielded his authority. His courtroom wasn't a chamber of justice, it was a stage, and his gavel was more prop than principle. He sat elevated above the room, quite literally and figuratively, with a posture that said, "I don't get challenged, I get obeyed." His wire-rimmed glasses caught the morning light as he scanned the docket, flipping pages like he was bored with the law, not burdened by it. People said he was fair, but they didn't say it with their mouths, they said it with their shoulders. Stiff when entering, slouched with relief when leaving. He had that kind of gravity, the kind that pulled heavier depending on your skin tone. By the time Sarah Collins walked in, the 9 o'clock eye-aiming session had already warmed up. 3 cases had been called. 2 white men had come in late, one at 9:07, the other close to 9:10. One got a nod and a muttered, "Don't let it happen again." The other got nothing at all. A young white woman in a tan pantsuit had slipped in just before Sarah, brushing past the bailiff with a smile. Judge Barrett hadn't blinked. But when Sarah entered, it was as if the room exhaled just to hold its breath again. The judge paused mid-sentence, narrowed his eyes, and looked at her like she'd broken a contract he didn't know he'd made. You could feel the shift, like humidity rising before a summer thunderstorm. "Step forward," he said, not looking at the docket, not asking for her name. His voice was sharp, clipped, like a cold wind slapping a window shut. Sarah kept her expression neutral, her steps measured. She stood at the podium like she'd stood in federal court 100 times, because she had. But this wasn't federal court, and this judge didn't see Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Collins. He saw a black woman 15 minutes late, and to him, that was all he needed. "You must be Sarah Collins," he said, finally glancing at the docket with theatrical annoyance. "Scheduled for 9 o'clock a.m. He tapped the paper like it had personally offended him. "Do you think your time is more valuable than this court's time, Miss Collins?" His emphasis on Miss was sharp, intentional, and condescending. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but he cut her off before a syllable could form. "In this courtroom, we respect the schedule. This isn't a coffee shop where you can roll in whenever it suits you. This is a court of law." His tone, his posture, his refusal to even let her explain. It wasn't about the time, it was about what he thought he saw. To him, she was a stereotype wrapped in a blazer. He didn't see the degrees, the trials, the human trafficking cases. He saw the lateness and the color of her skin, and that was all it took for the gavel in his mind to come crashing down. The robe gave him power. The bench gave him height. But the judgment? That came from somewhere deeper, somewhere quieter, somewhere learned. Sarah didn't argue. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for understanding. She stood tall, hands folded gently at her waist, like a woman who had seen this scene before and knew exactly how it played out. Because she had, many times, not always with a gavel, but always with the same undertones, the assumptions, the judgment before the hearing. She wasn't there to win the moment. She was there to witness it. And she wasn't alone. James Wilson, the bailiff, had been watching from his usual post by the wall. A tall black man with a strong jaw and tired eyes. James had seen more than his fair share of courtroom performances. But even he shifted his stance slightly when he saw how quickly the judge's mood changed at the sight of Sarah. He gave her a small nod. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to say, "I see it too." Mrs. Thompson, the clerk, had her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A woman who had typed up 12 years of court minutes without a word of complaint, she now hesitated. Her eyes moved from Sarah to the judge, and then to the clock. She knew how many others had arrived late that morning. She had logged every name and every timestamp. She saw the discrepancy, but like many who worked under robes, she had learned to keep her observations to herself. Still, she clicked her nails together, just once, as if trying to shake something loose. Sarah stayed silent, letting the moment marinate, letting the judge reveal more than he intended, because sometimes the most powerful rebuttal isn't a statement, it's a stare. A calm one, a measured one, the kind that turns walls into mirrors. And while the judge relished his moment of disciplinary grandeur, while he imagined himself as the symbol of order and respect, he didn't realize he was standing center stage in someone else's evidence file. He thought he was schooling her. What he didn't know was that she teaches federal law for a living. Judge Barrett leaned forward with the kind of self-satisfaction that only comes from power unchecked. His gavel hovered like a loaded accusation. "Miss Collins," he said, each syllable stretched like he was testing their weight. "This court hereby finds you in contempt. A fine of $500 is imposed, effective immediately." He didn't even glance at her as he said it, already reaching for the next file like she was a footnote in his morning. Around the room, a few people shifted uncomfortably, some looking down, some daring to look directly at Sarah, their expressions a mix of confusion, pity, and disbelief. $500 for being 15 minutes late. Sarah didn't blink. She didn't gasp, didn't argue, didn't so much as raise an eyebrow. But inside she felt the heat rise, not just from the punishment, but from the familiarity of it all. She had faced down violent criminals, white-collar liars, and billion-dollar cover-ups without losing her composure. But standing here, as a black woman in a courtroom built to reduce her to a disruption, something deeper stirred. Still, she simply nodded once and let the silence stretch. The judge moved on, ready to forget her, but she hadn't even begun. Her hand moved smoothly to the clasp of her briefcase. One click, then another. The sound was quiet, but in that courtroom it echoed like a countdown. She reached inside, not with urgency but with purpose, and pulled out a slim leather folder embossed with gold. She didn't hold it up like a weapon. She simply unfolded it and laid it gently on the podium. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, calm, and impossibly polite. "Before we proceed, I believe a proper introduction is in order for the record." Judge Barrett didn't look up right away. He was still buried in the next file, muttering something to the clerk, but the words "for the record" had weight. They didn't belong to a traffic violator. They belonged to a litigator. Slowly, almost begrudgingly, he looked back up, just in time to see the gold Department of Justice seal glint in the morning light. The room froze. Mrs. Thompson's fingers hovered above the keyboard. The young white woman who'd slid in late now sat perfectly still, her earlier nonchalance swallowed whole by the moment. Even James the bailiff, always composed, stood a little straighter. Sarah didn't change her tone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The badge did the shouting for her. "I am Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Collins," she continued, every word carved cleanly into the air, "currently serving in the Northern District of Georgia." Judge Barrett blinked. His lips parted, but no sound came out. The silence stretched again, this time not from disdain, but from disbelief. His hand, still resting on the file for the next case, slowly slipped off the edge of the paper like it had forgotten what it was holding. For the first time that morning, he really looked at her. Not the way he had before, when she was just another black woman in slacks and a blazer. This time, he saw something he hadn't expected, someone he hadn't prepared for, someone who belonged in a courtroom far more than he did in this moment. "I apologize for my tardiness this morning," Sarah said, still perfectly calm. "I was urgently called to assist with a federal matter, the Thompson human trafficking prosecution, which Your Honor may be familiar with from the news." She paused just long enough to let it sink in. "I have documentation from the U.S. Attorney's Office confirming the timeline. Would the court like a copy for the record?" Barrett's face, once crimson with righteous fury, now faded to a pale, muddled pink. He looked down at the credentials again, then up at Sarah, and suddenly the distance between the bench and the floor seemed less like a symbol of power and more like a spotlight on his misstep. The bailiff coughed once into his hand, the only sound in a room so still you could hear the hum of the ceiling fan. Behind them, people were no longer shuffling or whispering. They were staring. Every witness in that room knew they'd just watched something shift. The judge tried to recover. He cleared his throat twice, reached for a pen, then set it down. "Attorney Collins, But the sentence never landed. There was no script for this part. He had made his statement, and now she had made hers. Hers came with federal credentials. His came with a receipt for bias, now written in courtroom ink. And that was just her opening statement. Judge Barrett straightened in his seat like he could somehow rewind the last 5 minutes with posture alone. He cleared his throat, forced a polite smile, and tapped his gavel once, not to silence the room but to soften his own embarrassment. Assistant U.S. Attorney Collins," he began, his voice shifting into something that tried to sound respectful. "Given the circumstances, the court is willing to dismiss the fine. Let's consider this," and his tone wrapped the insult in ribbon, as if he were offering her a favor, not a cover-up. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't smile, didn't blink, didn't bend. She simply nodded once and replied, "Respectfully, Your Honor, I decline." The silence recoiled, then leaned forward again, Barrett's eyebrows lifted, confused. She continued, "I would prefer the fine remain on the record. As it stands, it may be the most accurate documentation of what occurred here this morning." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It was the calm of someone who had argued constitutional law in federal courtrooms and didn't come to municipal court looking for mercy. Just proof. "A receipt," she said, tapping the podium gently, "is sometimes the best evidence." The courtroom seemed to lean toward her, and she let it. She opened the notebook in front of her and began to read, not dramatically, but methodically, like a prosecutor laying out counts in an indictment. "As of this morning, I've documented 7 late arrivals to this courtroom since 9:00 a.m. Of those 7, 3 were white professionals who received no comment from the bench. 2 were Asian students who received verbal warnings, and 2 were black, myself included, who received the harshest rebukes. One of us received a $500 0-cent fine. I don't believe I need to explain what that suggests." The numbers landed like thunderclaps in a courtroom built to hide the storm. Sarah turned slightly, letting her eyes move across the gallery, not to plead, but to make sure they all heard it. Mrs. Thompson had stopped typing, her fingers hovering like they didn't want to interrupt history. Sarah went on. "Last week, a white male attorney arrived 20 minutes late and was met only with a brief nod. That, too, is recorded." She held up the printout. "Mrs. Thompson can confirm the docket. I've reviewed the clerk logs." The room was no longer just silent, it was charged like air before lightning. The law student in the back gripped her pen with white knuckles, scribbling feverishly. A middle-aged man in a suit who had chuckled earlier now sat stiff, his arms folded tight across his chest, no longer sure which side of the story he was sitting on. James, the bailiff, shifted his stance again, but this time it wasn't restraint. It was recognition. He had seen these moments before. Quiet bias passed off as policy, but never like this, never with someone willing to write it down and say it out loud in real time. Sarah paused, letting her words fill the space that had never been offered to voices like hers. She looked back to the judge, not with anger, but with precision. "This courtroom," she said, "is not immune to the patterns we prosecute every day. And this morning's proceedings are not isolated. They are documented, they are witnessed, and they will be reported." Her tone was firm but measured, the cadence of someone unshaken by consequence. "As an officer of the federal court," she continued, "I am formally submitting a request for internal review to the Judicial Qualifications Commission, and I've already notified the U.S. Attorney's Office." Judge Barrett opened his mouth, then shut it. There was nothing to say that wouldn't become part of the story already writing itself. His grip tightened on his gavel, not to use it, but to hold something, anything, that still felt like control. But even the gavel seemed quieter now, less potent. Behind Sarah, the courtroom clerk slowly began typing again. this time with the urgency of someone trying to record the very moment the air shifted. Her fingers moved faster than they had all year, driven not by routine, but by responsibility. James gave a single nod. It wasn't performative, it wasn't for Sarah, it was for everyone who had watched bias walk in and justice rise anyway. Sarah stood tall at the podium, the fine still unpaid but now powerful. Because this wasn't about $500, 0 cents. It never was. She had paid in dignity, in patience, in years of being the only voice in the room who saw it and couldn't say it. But today? Today she said it. Out loud, for the record. And the fine was just the opening bid. The fine was paid, but the system? It was just starting to feel the interest. By noon, the courthouse buzzed with whispers louder than verdicts. What happened in Judge Barrett's courtroom didn't stay there. A young law student who had watched the entire exchange from the back row texted her study group, and by the time lunch was served in Atlanta's legal circles, everyone with a bar card knew Sarah Collins didn't just fight a fine, she indicted a system. Her name began to ripple through office hallways, civil rights groups, public defenders' inboxes, and lunchroom banter like gospel. "Did you hear what she did?" was followed by, "I've seen it happen too," and then, "It's about time someone with power said something." By the time evening fell, a local journalist had picked up the scent. Channel 5's Michael Chen stood outside the courthouse reporting what he called the day a $500 0 cents ticket exposed a 30-year pattern. The headline on social media hit harder: "Federal Prosecutor Turns Courtroom into Accountability Hearing." Lawyers began sharing their own stories, mostly quietly, some anonymously, about what they'd experienced in Barrett's court. But it wasn't just about him anymore. The spark had caught. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk who had sat silently behind her keyboard for over a decade, unlocked a drawer she had kept closed for 12 years. Inside, a small, spiral-bound notebook filled with dates, initials, docket numbers, and notes scribbled in careful handwriting. Disparities she had noticed. Patterns she couldn't unsee. Cases where the only difference was the color of the defendant's skin, and the difference in outcome was undeniable. She had written them down because they bothered her. She had kept them because she knew one day they'd matter. That day had come. She wasn't alone. As Sarah's story gained traction, clerks from neighboring courts quietly began checking their own records. Whispers turned to emails. Emails turned to shared folders. Patterns emerged, not just in Barrett's courtroom, but across others in the district. One judge handed down fines 5 times higher to black defendants. Another interrupted female lawyers twice as often as male ones. The receipts were real, and now they had an audience. By the end of the week, a formal request was filed with the Judicial Qualifications Commission. A federal review team assembled, a task force of legal analysts, former judges, and civil rights lawyers. Their mission: audit the last 10 years of fines, sentences, and contempt rulings across the municipal courts. Within days, the findings were staggering. The average fine for black defendants was nearly triple that of white defendants for the same violations. Requests for payment plans were denied more often for people of color. Verbal warnings were disproportionately reserved for white defendants. What had started with a banana and a traffic ticket now had the weight of data to back the outrage. And then came Barrett's reckoning. 3 weeks after Sarah Collins stood in his courtroom, Judge Barrett faced the commission that had once praised his efficiency. He sat in a polished conference room, not as a judge, but as a man now forced to reckon with the paper trail behind his robe. When presented with the data, his silence spoke louder than his gavel ever had. He tried to say he had never meant it, that he had always believed he was fair. But belief isn't evidence, and intent doesn't erase impact. In a statement released to the media, Judge Garrett announced his resignation, citing a desire not to distract from the work of the courts. But what came next stunned even those who had long criticized him. He asked to join the new judicial training initiative focused on bias education and procedural reform. "I was blind to my patterns," he admitted, "and now I want to help others see." It didn't erase what had been done, but it cracked open the door to something rare, accountability paired with humility. Sarah watched it all unfold from her office window. The city skyline spread behind her like a courtroom of its own. She hadn't set out to make headlines. She just hadn't planned on sitting quietly while the same old story repeated itself under different lighting. One woman brought the mirror, and the court couldn't look away. But change isn't just policy, it's personal. And the change? It was just beginning. Sarah Collins didn't keep the $500 0 cents fine out of spite. She kept it because some moments are too costly to forget. The printed slip, bare, bureaucratic, sterile, was framed in dark walnut and hung just to the left of her office window. Beneath it, she added a small brass plaque. Issued for being 15 minutes late, filed under equal protection. It wasn't a trophy. It was a receipt for courage. Quiet reminder that justice isn't always clean, but it should always leave a mark. Every client who entered her office saw it. Every intern who asked about it got a lesson their law books didn't teach. That frame didn't just hold paper. It held memory. And memory, when honored, becomes momentum. Word of her stance had not just spread, it had settled into the structure of reform. Within 2 months, the Georgia Bar Association approved a proposal for independent judicial review panels in all municipal courts. Judges, once shielded by robes and routine, now submitted quarterly reports on fines, contempt rulings, and racial disparities. Law schools across the Southeast added Sarah's courtroom testimony to their ethics curriculum. Some professors taught it as case law, others as case study, a few more boldly as modern precedent. Civil rights clinics, once scraping by on shoestring budgets, were suddenly granted new funding, new fellowships, new fire. What had once been anecdotal injustice became documented proof, and proof demanded policy. But what moved Sarah most weren't the headlines, it was the letters. The first came from a law student in Alabama who had seen the transcript online. "You gave me language," she wrote, "for what I've seen but never knew how to fight." Another came from a former municipal clerk who had quit her job a year ago, burned out by patterns she couldn't unsee. "I thought I was crazy. Now I know I was just early." And then came a note scrawled in blue ink on yellowing paper, shaky handwriting, no return address. "I sat in court in 1963 for loitering. They fined me $10 0 cents for standing still. I watched you stand, taller than any bench I've ever seen. Thank you. It finally feels like justice might be blind." Sarah read that one twice. The city transformed slowly, but it transformed. Metal plaques with updated codes were installed on courthouse walls. Diversity training wasn't just a checkbox, it was a requirement for licensure renewal. A new initiative allowed defendants to request anonymous judicial reviews, and a citizen panel met monthly to audit cases with potential bias flags. No more rubber stamps. No more closed doors. James Wilson, the quiet bailiff who had watched from the corner that morning, had since been promoted. He now trained courtroom officers statewide, telling every new recruit, "You're not just security, you're witnesses." And Sarah? She was no longer just a prosecutor. She was now a lecturer, an advisor to reform boards, a mentor to dozens of law students who had found their voice in the echo of hers. One fall afternoon, she walked into a courtroom, not to defend herself, but to deliver the keynote address for Georgia's inaugural Judicial Equity Conference. The room was packed with judges, clerks, attorneys, law students. The plaque of her fine sat on the podium beside her, upright, unpolished, undeniable. She didn't begin with a thank you or a joke. She began with a question. The justice system didn't change overnight, but did it notice? That's what matters. She told them the story, not just about the fine, but about the silence that came before it, and the wave that came after. She reminded them that bias isn't always loud. It's often coded, polite, procedural. It shows up in who gets warnings and who gets punished, in who gets believed and who gets fined. And then she paused, let her eyes move across the room, and said, "If you hold a gavel, You don't just keep order. You shape history. Be careful what shape you choose. The applause was long, but it wasn't loud. It was reverent, thoughtful. It carried weight. Weeks later, she received one final letter, hand-delivered to her office. It was from that same law student who had texted her study group the day it all began. The student had started a legal aid clinic at her university. Her message was simple. You showed me that one woman can rewire the system without raising her voice. It started with a fine. It ended with a movement. Sarah looked up at the framed receipt on her wall, sunlight glinting off the glass. Some days, it still made her angry. Most days, it made her grateful. But every day, it made her remember what happens when one person stops pretending not to notice. And that's when the system finally has to look in the mirror and blink first. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.